Oh,
had
boy.
similar experiences, although we didn't have any murders in my family.
Oh, well, I didn't either. I mean, come on.
Oh, I thought it was autobiographical.
No, this is, you can't pin any of this on me.
Uh-huh.
Ross.
And you use a lot of foul language that I remember very well. And it's
From the
always
old
appropriate.
neighborhood, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, very good.
Yes.
We got a copy. I think we have 2 copies in our library.
Excellent.
There it is.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Good.
So you had quite a career as a top professor at SIU.
Yeah, that was the place I retired from. I taught at other places, but I spent 26 years there, and I retired emeritus there in 2005.
Oh, okay. Well, you didn't ever have my son as a student. He was not a good student, but he managed to get through. It took him 6 years.
Well, that was par for the course back then. A lot of kids took 5, 6, 7 years, unfortunately.
But he turned out okay. He's an insurance State Farm agent now.
Well, very good. Good for him. Good. Good.
Matter.
So did you get to Chicago much?
Not as much as I would like. I have a son that lives in Jefferson Park.
Oh,
He's a finance guy. He's a vice president of a company up there, a food company, and he's in charge of finance. And Chicago is his adopted home. After he got out of the Peace Corps, he ended up in Chicago working for a bank, and he had an interesting time there. But someone just talked him into going back to graduate school, and he decided to go for an MBA. And so the choice was between the University of Chicago versus Northwestern, and he chose Chicago. And so he's an MBA, international MBA from Chicago. He's very internationally minded kind of guy.
oh, well, that's good. That the Peace Corps experience.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if anybody's written a book on the impact of the Peace Corps on the people and on the countries, but I bet it's been significant. It seemed like it would be something that we would have expanded in the good, more hopeful days.
Yeah, we should have. That's for sure. It was a good thing when I went to school. It was just the beginning.
Yeah.
Of the Peace Corps, and it was a lot of fun. I remember I was on a campus where they were training Peace Corps people, and I got to interact with a lot of them, and they were very interesting folks.
Yeah.
Actually,
It's a great experience. Anyhow, we have an Italian American Studies program at Loyola, and Carla Simonini, the holder of the position, the director, is going to be on this Zoom call as well.
I know. I see her there. Yes.
Oh,
I think that's wonderful.
If you come to Chicago, let us know, and we'll have
Good.
Create some get together. Maybe you can visit a class or something.
I'd love to do that. As a matter of fact, it'd be very enjoyable to do so. That'd be great.
Okay. I'm pleased to introduce today our guest, Professor Albert Melone. Albert is from Chicago originally, but he also did some growing up time in California, and he ended up as a key professor at SIU in Carbondale. And he has written many books in his field, which is interesting, but our interest here is Italian American studies, so we're single-minded on this. And he has written quite an interesting novel with a very good title, Mezzogiorno in Chicago. And it's a very rewarding book with fascinating stories. And authentic references that put his, well, I thought it was thoroughly autobiographical, but he tells me now that it isn't autobiographical. It's just a novel, just a novel. But I'm pleased to present today Professor Albert Melone.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be with you. I think your project there at Casa, Italia is a wonderful undertaking. I know you've been engaged in this yourself for many years, and it's wonderful that you're doing that. And the cooperation with Loyola University in Chicago is a good idea. It's a good thing to put these two things together. So you have academics and writers and activists working together to solve the puzzle of Italian Americans living here in America. So that's
well
great.
put. Well
Yes.
put.
Maybe I should just briefly review the basic thesis of the book, or the outline of the book. I hate to spend too much time on that because I really want to get to the more meaty questions. But let me just, for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read my novel, I'll give you a short overview. What happens here is that a bright young woman from the Abruzzi region is called to America to marry a person that she has not met. Now, she's a very particular person, a very bright person. She had some convent education as part of her upbringing. She's a good Catholic in that sense, but also importantly, unlike many of her villagers, she was able to read and write. And she often spent many of her leisure hours talking to the old timers in the village, in the piazza there, speaking to them about a variety of topics, reading to them some of the newspapers and the stories and the activities of Italians abroad and so on. Anyway, her brother, who's one of those workers like my grandparents and their parents, by the way, who traveled to America to make a few dollars for the home team, for the family, and to send those remittances back to America. Well, anyway, on his as part of his activities there in Chicago, he meets this person by the name of Frankie Antonelli, and Frankie Antonelli gets to see a photograph of his lovely sister, Richella, and immediately he's pursuing Richella and trying to convince Dominic, who by the way has become the head of the household because the father of the household, the Di Capo, passes away, and he leaves two boys and Richella and his wife there to fend for themselves in this little village community in Abruzzi, in the mountains there. And so Dominic, the oldest son, arranges this marriage. Richella is reluctant to do so because actually Richella was in one time in love with a son of a leading figure in the area, one of the landed aristocracy. And they become very close and really rather romantically inclined. However, he decides that he wants to become a priest.
Yeah. What a turn.
And so this poor woman is left brokenhearted. And there aren't any really eligible people around in that community to really meet her standards. So the brother, Dominic, who's in Chicago, arranges with Frankie Antonelli, who's a Napolitano, and this Napolitano keeps insisting, listen, I want to marry your sister. She's beautiful. Everything I know about her is so wonderful. So please arrange this for me. And well, he arranges it, although there are certain demands placed on it. on that, including no dowries involved, as was the tradition in many families at that time, although they really didn't have much money to put in terms of a dowry. But nonetheless, they refused to do that. But Frankie agrees to pay the passage, not only for Rachella, but for her mother. She wasn't going to leave her mother behind. So we're talking about what, around $70 at that time, which is a lot of money for an average worker who's working, by the way, as Dominic worked in the streets, in construction, digging the ditches, creating the infrastructure, as we would say today, of the city of Chicago, basically creating sewer systems, hooking up pipes and so on. This heavy duty work, backbreaking work that so many Italian Americans were involved in at the turn of the century, or around the turn of the century. They arrive, it's an interesting, and I tell the story about their arrival to Chicago on the boat, and the trials and tribulations of all of that, which I'm sure you're already familiar with. In many ways, it's an old story. It's been told many times. But anyway, they finally arrived in Chicago at the Dearborn Street station, I think it was, from the train from New York after Ellis Island experience to Chicago. And they meet with the jobber, the boss, who arranges jobs for these Italian Americans, who happens to be, or Italians, I should say, he happens to be an Italian American himself, and whose parents came from Abruzzo. But he speaks both languages well, etc.
That's Guido.
Housing, does great jobs for them, and of course he gets a slice of everything he does. They earn for these services. That's how these people made their money. These jobbers. There's a special name that slips me at the moment. Anyway, Frankie Antonelli, this Napolitan guy, is not there when when Rachella and her mother and family arrive. And where is he? He's back in Napoli because his poor mother is sick and dying. Okay, and so he's there out of a duty to his mother. But in the meantime, she's there by herself, and her mother and her brother.
Yeah.
And she hooks up with the good people at Jane Addams' place, Hull House. She gets involved in various activities, including learning how to learn English. She decides she needs to learn English. She gets a little job in a shop, a butcher shop on Taylor Street. It doesn't pay much, but at least it's a start for her. And while she's in these lessons at the Hull House, she falls in love with this other person who prefers to be called Pete because that's what his bosses call him and not his Italian name, but Pete. And Pete and Rachella fall in love, and they have a romance, and lo and behold, Frankie finally shows up, but it's too late. They're already in love. Anyway, Frankie turns out to be something of a gangster, and the family, the Russo family, Rachella's family, doesn't want anything to do with gangster types. These are dishonest, type of people that you don't want anything to do with. And so what happens is he of course becomes jealous. Frankie does whatever he thinks necessary to get Rachella back, but then nothing works. Eventually, Pete and Rachella are married in church, and at the wedding reception held at a restaurant, local restaurant, Frankie shows up with a little pistol in his hand and shoots Rachella in the chest. He doesn't kill her, but Anthony dies. Excuse me, Frankie dies. The shooter dies. And in the book, I tell a story how this happens. I'll let you use your own imagination how this might happen in the old neighborhood. Okay, so that's the core of the story, the beginning of the story. Richella is very family oriented. She has 4 kids. Eventually, she's centered around her home or her family, whereas her husband Pete is not only family concerned, but is also concerned with others. He has sympathy for others. He's active in the union movement. And I tell the story of the union movement in the city of Chicago, or at least part of that story. And I tell the story about the rich and the well-born and the industrialists in Chicago that did everything in their power to defeat collective bargaining any way they could. So life goes on. She goes out and scrubs floors without her husband knowing about it. She gets her mother, Angela, to cover for her while she's out scrubbing floors. She does this for a good number of years. She works for the rich people on the Gold Coast, and happily, and so she finally gets enough money, and circumstances are such where she springs on her husband that she's got this money, and that she wants to open up a shop of her own. And he says to her, well, that's fine, but listen, I'm not going to work in a grocery store, in a butcher shop. You know, I'm someone who knows things. I know about swords, and I know about plumbing. I know about electricity. So please, we got to figure something else out. So what do they figure out? They figure out they're going to rent out the space of the building they're living in at the ground level from this German landlord, who's quite an interesting figure in and of itself. You know about, of course, the relationship between the Germans and the Italians in those early generations, where the Germans, of course, preceded the Italians in that old neighborhood. They helped build, of course, the famous Holy Family Church there on Roosevelt Road. The Italians finished it, but the Germans started it, right? They really got it going. And there's a kind of antagonism. There's an ethnic prejudices that exist that's deeply rooted, and so on. So I don't know if I want to tell you any more at this point. I'll talk a little bit more about it as I go on, because I'd really like to talk about some of the important ideas that I think the Italians, Americans, and the Italians in the first generation in particular are imparted to others.
Before you go on to that, Albert, let me ask you where you learned all this stuff about Italians in Chicago, the DeAndrea thing, the Hull House information, and that kind of thing. There are a lot of real things I know you didn't make up that are in the story, and you allude to a lot of really factual stuff in addition to the storyline, the fictional storyline.
Good question. Okay, I'll fill you in. In the 1970s, when I first started out in academic life, I was teaching at North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota, up there in the cold country. It was a lovely place, by the way, the lovely people, lovely students, and I enjoyed it very much. But I would visit Chicago from time to time because I would go to professional meetings in Chicago. The Midwest Political Science Association often met at the Palmer House in Chicago, and back in those days, I think they still do, I'm not quite sure anymore. But they met, and I would visit some relatives. And one of the relatives I often meet with is a second cousin. And it's her family that's the model for this book, okay? It's my father's cousin, okay? And the broad story has been told over and over again by this family. As a young child, I quite remember these stories. I remember the people. I remember the woman who's our heroine in the story, and I remember her husband, and I remember her brothers, who were quite interesting figures, and so on. And my father would always tell me stories. Like, we moved from Chicago when I was very young. My mother died at a very young age of cancer, and he moved us out to Chicago, out to Los Angeles for a new start, a different life, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm on my mother's side, by the way, had a gigantic family. These were Calabres people. I think there were 14 or 15 kids in this family. Wonderful, happy family. The other side of the family, the Melones, were not as quite as happy. We had more difficult times, I think. But nonetheless, she wanted me, this cousin of mine, wanted me to write a biography. And I said, hey, I can't do this. I'm too busy in my own life, my academic life. I couldn't take time to do this. You're working like heck, as you know, to gain tenure and to write those things you need to write, and so on and so on. So, but I never left, the idea never left my head that I ought to do something. And after I retired, I figured, well, here's a time to do something different. I never wrote a novel. So what the heck, write a novel, try it. It's got to be difficult, right? Because I've always written monographs and textbooks and that sort of stuff. And it's a different, obviously, kind of writing. And so I said, well, I'll take this on as a challenge. So I had a broad outlines, and that's all the book is based on, is these broad outlines of what I had in my head. I didn't know the individual interactions per se of all these people. Obviously, I had to use a great deal of imagination. Now, what did I do? Well, after I retired, I read a lot. I was always interested in popular Italian culture, like Luigi Barzini, and everyone read The Godfather and all that stuff. So I read that, and I read other Italian works. Okay, and then of course, reading this background, because I was interested in World War II, and I was interested in Mussolini and company, and the whole development of Italian society and Italian nationhood. And so, I had to know more about the Italian Americans in Chicago. Of course, I knew a lot about it by virtue of growing up in a family that told a lot of these stories, but that wasn't enough. So I had to get my hand on everything that's been written, including some of your own books, Dominic. I read several of your books, and the books.
Oh, I'll pat myself on the back.
Oh yeah, tremendous stuff. Really added a lot, and the stuff that was written earlier, and so I put it all together. It took me 10 years to write this book.
Really?
Oh yeah, it took me 10 years. Well, I worked on and off this book. I did a couple of new editions of older books, textbooks I'd written, and so I did that. And in the meantime, I wrote this book on and off. I kept working on it, and I was involved in multiple drafts. I kept working on it and trying to get it in a respectable form. And all the time I'm learning, okay? I'm learning about Italian American. I'm learning about Italy. I'm learning more about my own Catholicism, because that's part of this story, it seems to me, to fully understand the Italian American experience. So that's what happened, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, let me get into one of the important points, I think, that you can learn from this book. And I call these the maxims for survival Italian style. That is, the coping skills that were learned, that were passed on by the founding generations here in America, the founding of the Italian American community, and how they passed this on to their children, and how their children had the opportunity to pass it on to their children, et cetera. And so, as you read through this book, I think you will find these maxims popping up in your face. I don't call them that, of course, in the book, but that's what they are. They're based on that old principle in Italian culture of la via vecchia. You have to follow the old road, meaning the old values centered on the family. And that's the key, I think, to understanding so much of the Italian-American experience and to learn from the Italian-American experience. Now, some of these rules or maxims cause friction between the first and the later generations because, as you well know, Americana culture pulled many of the offspring and later generations to a view of America where each person is responsible for him or herself. That is, the individualistic culture, qua the selfish culture, is something somehow a good thing. It represents what we call today in modern social science, I've noticed more and more call this today, the I versus the we society. And indeed, we have had waves in American society of I-centered culture versus the we-centered culture. I would argue that we've been weighted rather heavily toward the I culture rather than the we culture, but at times it's offset by the we culture. Now, let me talk about some of these rules. No doubt there are more, but these are the ones that I quickly hit upon as I reviewed the book for your talk here today, the first is that the head of the family speaks for the whole family. Do not evidence divisions that opponents may use to divide and to conquer us. Be very, very careful in doing that. Keep your mouth shut while the head of the family, and that's typically the father, or if the father is not present, the oldest son. Carla, that's certainly an example of American society or of Italian culture being rather patriotic in its nature, but that's the way it was. So that the head of the family is the sole spokesperson in dealing with all kinds of issues, and I'll discuss them as I go along. A corollary to that rule is you don't trust outsiders. You trust the family and the paesani narrowly defined. It's not like we often define paesani here in this country as anyone who's an Italian. No, you trust those you grew up with, those who were within hearing distance of the church bells of your village. You can trust these people. They grew up with you. You know them. You know their relatives, their parents, their grandparents, and so on. And you have a rule of sticking together whenever possible. So there's this responsibility that one has toward the family, and you follow the rules of the family as much as possible. There's a figure in the book who's a pawnbroker and a banker in the Italian neighborhood in Taylor Street neighborhood in particular, who, and there were several of these types of people that existed around the turn of the century, who sold themselves as paisans, but they weren't really paisans. They were from all over the place. They were Italians, but they weren't paisans. And they said, trust me. You can trust me with your money. I'll take care of it. So these people would trust them. And comes the Depression, come the Great Depression with the bankruptcies and the stock service falling all apart. They lost the money that they invested, that they took from the depositors. And that included one of the relatives here. One of the brother, the widow of the brother that dies at a young age, put all her money, wasn't a lot, but it was enough, put her money in the bank. And this pawnbroker said to her, "Oh, don't keep your money, don't worry about it. Don't worry about depression. Your money will be safe." Well, within a few days, it was all gone. And so they held that against, and there was an example. You don't trust people who are not of your own blood and of your own small community. Now, there are rules of negotiation that you learn in this book, it seems to me. These are rules that meet the common sense definition of good business. But the first rule is, when you're involved in a negotiation, have all the facts at hand. So when you're negotiating, in our example, with that German landlord who wanted to rent out that property below to the Volini family so that they can open up the stores, know the facts, know his weaknesses, know what he really wanted. Well, he was foolish enough to let them know that he wanted to leave Chicago because Chicago was cold and he was tired of walking up and down these stairs, collecting the rents on a weekly or a monthly basis or whenever it was. And he wanted to move to Florida. So he and his wife would move to Florida.
You had to be Forbo.
I beg your pardon?
You had to be Forbo.
Yes, Forbo. You had to be smart. That's one of my next points. Yeah, you had to be shrewd. You had to be smart like the fox. Yes.
Yeah, my mother was always disappointed in me that I wasn't Forbo.
Very important principle, right? You got to be sharp. Well, they figured out this, Pete, the head of the household, figured out this weakness. And so he negotiated a very shrewd deal and got what he wanted on the rent. In return for taking care of the property, he didn't pay any rent. He took care of the property by himself. And in fact, he got the landlord to pay for whatever replacements were necessary during that time. But he was a pretty good fix-it man, and the German knew about this. So they made a deal. Eventually, during the Depression itself, the Volini family purchases the property from the fat German. Why? Because they surmise and get to know the fact that during the Depression, he lost a lot of money in the stock market. So he needed the cash. So they came up with the cash. They were able to come up with some cash. They were able to get a bank loan, and that's another story that I tell in the book.
Incidentally, you mentioned
I beg your pardon?
Volini. Did you know that there was a very famous Volini family in Chicago, beginning with Camillo Volini, who was a doctor in the 1890s and then 1910s, ran an anti-mafia campaign, and that his sons and grandsons became doctors and close to Loyola and that sort of thing.
How interesting.
So
I did not know
so
that. I made the name up. Because of course I wanted to protect the innocent, right? So I made the name up out of my own head.
Well, that's interesting. I wondered if it was going to connect, but it didn't connect to the actual.
It didn't, but it would have been a very good connection. That would have been a very good point. Yes, very good.
I buy a whole case. You buy a case?
Yes, very good. Now, your principles of getting along, they could be used in the business school.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They could be used anywhere. Any thoughtful person would consider these things as a way of doing it. But Pete and his family understood all of this. And you know, they were smart. Their Forbo was important to them. They learned this in the old country, and they imported it.
Quiet, please. Yes, and let's see if we can go on to some questions or comments from the group.
Okay.
Anybody have anything? I can't see you now. I'm just using my phone, but anyone could unmute yourself and speak up. Yeah, this was very interesting. The dialogue, you didn't attempt to use broken English in creating the dialogue. That's really hard. And so I don't blame you for that. But I imagine that these people in the 1930s were mostly speaking broken English.
I think so. Yes, I think so. Yeah, it was, I made a conscious decision not to try to do that. It was too hard to do for me.
Yeah, it is hard. The only people who did it well are the actors in Life with Luigi. And they weren't Italian at all. I don't know if you remember that. You might be of an age to remember Luigi Bosco, the radio show. Anyhow,
Luigi,
a
yeah.
question, Mary Maturi Gibson.
Yes, with Luigi was one of my parents' favorite radio shows when I was little. But you talked about those principles. Those principles were from people all over Italy. My parents were Sicilian. They came here from Sicily. And I just finished a book about my father that should be out in a couple of months. And I related the story of him buying a new car. And he asked the price, once he found the car he wanted, he asked the price of it, and it was $6,000. And so he had his bag of money and he paid cash in small bills, like dollar bills, quarters, nickels, dimes. I mean, the people were going nuts trying to count all this money in order to make $6,000. But he brought it to the dealership in a grain sack. Then we got the grain in for the animals on the farm. So all those principles were throughout Italy. You pay cash for everything. You don't buy anything on credit. Those kind of things. So it was interesting.
Yeah, that happened to my own family. It happened to me, as a matter of fact. My father wanted me to pick up a car. He negotiated a price on a car. It was a Plymouth, I remember. And he insisted that they put undercoating on the car. This was part of his deal. And he wasn't going to pay extra for it. And he gave me money. I think it was $3,000 in cash. And I had to walk to the car dealer with $3,000 in my pocket. I'm a young guy, okay? $3,000 in my pocket, with the specific instructions. You make sure they have that undercoating or you walk away. So I show up, and sure enough, they had no intention to put the undercoating on. They were gonna cheat us out of that. So I walked away. And a week later, the guy from the car dealer called up my father and said, okay, it's all taken care of. You can come pick up the car. Okay, that's the way he negotiated, right? You did that. You walked away from, I used to see him walk away from a deal. Well, what was a $100 difference on a car, for example? He'd walk away. You had to be that kind of shrewd. You had to learn that. And that was a trait of you. You're right, the Italians. They knew how to do that. They had nerves of steel. I tried to teach my own children that. But as I get older, I find I'm no longer good at that.
No.
I was good at it at a young age, but not anymore.
The problem is that you can't be in America. America is based on credit. That's it. Nowadays, 50, 60 years ago, you could do that. You could just go into a store and negotiate cash for something. You can't do that now. If you don't have credit and credit cards and a million of them, nobody wants to even talk to you.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Yeah. Carla, are you out there? You have a comment or question?
I don't think she's there anymore.
Okay, I have a story on.
Here she is. She's there.
Okay, you saved from my story about my mother. Go ahead.
I can't hear Carla.
Yeah.
Is Carla muted?
Yeah, while Carla works on her microphone, we have a question from Maria Rosario.
Okay, Maria?
You hear me now?
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Let's
we can
hear
hear
from
you.
Carla.
Oh, I'm sorry. I only had headphones in, but it must have had me had me on the mic through them. No, thank you, Dr. Melone, for a really interesting presentation. My internet has been a little shaky, so I went in and out, but I think I caught most of it. A couple of comments I wanted to make. This idea, we just read in my class a book by a British author from the turn of the century, Norman Douglas, and he was one of the first Brits who did a travel memoir about his time in Calabria. And one of the things he was trying to do in that travel memoir was introduce his compatriots, his fellow Brits, you know, to Southern Italian culture and to give them insight into what they can expect while they're there. And one of the two words he uses are furbizia, you know, being furbo, and the other one is being shamo, which is being soft in the head. And the idea is that if you're shamo, you know, you kind of deserve to be taken advantage of. I mean, and so there's, my students kind of reacted to that, you know, with, you know, from a cultural standpoint, like, oh, that's terrible, you know, but that was part of like the expectation that you negotiate and that you understand what things should cost and that you go in and you're clever and you look at things very carefully. And so, you know, it was an early example of an Anglo-Saxon writer trying to explain that cultural mindset to people who are not from that culture. So that goes way back. I thought that was fascinating. So
isn't it interesting that many of the people from England have great appreciation for the Italian culture?
oh yeah, I mean the
They
grand
love
tour.
Yeah, they love it. They love it. Yeah.
Absolutely, they do.
Although they didn't show much respect for Italy during World or after World War I, but that's another matter. Okay. That's another story.
I was interested too, you say in your bio that you're third generation. Now, I always teach my students that the first generation are the actual immigrants, and then the second would be the first. I mean, so I'm assuming that if you're using that same criteria, that your parents were born in the States and then you were as well, and that the original immigrants would have been your grandparents, correct?
Correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's always a source of confusion for me. Because I've seen it both ways.
Yeah, the general thing is to count the immigrants as the first generation for.
Right, the first, yeah, the immigrants, right. And yeah, and both sides of my family came from Italy, one from Calabria and the other from Abruzzo.
The
The big thing about Calabria, when you talked about being soft in the head, is that I've often been accused of being a hardhead.
Oh, testa rosta, or testa dura.
Very determined, you know.
Yeah.
Yes, which is not a virtue, by the way. Told it's not a virtue. And,
Albert, what about your experience in Italy? Have you been to Italy much?
yeah, I've been there a few times.
Language.
Yeah, well, I've been there a few times. What little Italian I know, I had to teach myself, unfortunately. And one of the lessons of the book, I think, is that Angela, the grandmother, is making this argument on a couple of occasions that we ought to teach the children Italian. That is part of their culture. But as you know, there was a period after the Italians came here, where some elements of the community said we shouldn't confuse the kids. We're trying to learn two languages at the same time. That was a bad idea. They would look stupid and so on, which I think was a genuine mistake, if I may say.
It could only make them smarter.
Yeah, right. Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, I've been to Italy a few times. Actually, my oldest son, Dominic, who has this great name, Dominic, is named after his grandfather, my father. Has been to Italy many times, basically because he married a girl whose parents are from Napoli, and she has living relatives in Napoli. And they go to Napoli. She likes to visit her aunts and her uncles in Napoli, and they've traveled extensively through Italy. And by the way, I had him look at some of my geography in this book to make sure I was on the right track. In fact, he indicated a few times that I might, I could improve it by changing the location of one thing or another. So yeah, I've never been to Abruzzo though, which I'm very, very unhappy about. I'll go there for international conferences, Rome, Florence, and so on, and which are great places, obviously, but it's not
The different Italy, yeah.
Yeah, it's not like really visiting the homeland.
Pizzoli, was that a real place of origin of your family?
What's that?
Pizzoli.
No,
Pizzoli.
no, that was a made up place. The other family, Scontrone, the Pete's family came from Scontrone. Is that, I think that's correct.
Scontrone, yeah.
In Abruzzo. That's the, 90% sure that's the family origin. The reason I say I'm 90% sure is that when we look at the genealogy and you look at the Ellis Island addresses they put down for people where they're from, it often just says Italy on it. It
Yeah.
doesn't say where they came from, you know? So it's a source of confusion for me to figure that out. My grandmother, my father's mother, came from a place, a city there in the province of Aquila, so that's part of it. And then my grandparents on the other side, my mother's side, were from Calabria, from the tip of the boot there, from that community there. So.
Well, what about the Chicago geography? Where on Ogden Avenue was this apartment building with stores on the first floor?
Well, they've made it into a medical center now, I'm told. I mean, I visited there trying to locate the actual place. I remember when I was a kid visiting that family and they had this building. This is not a made up building, a real building. And on the side of the building said Melone Hardware Store, is what it said.
Uh-huh.
So it exists there. It's on, I'm not sure the proper intersections, but it's not too far away from the old Taylor Street neighborhood. So I think I say in the book it was
County?
a mile or so or 2 miles away.
Near the county hospital?
Yeah, I think it was near the county hospital. Yeah,
Well, I'll look around for it.
yeah. But it became a medical center. They tore down all those buildings there, unfortunately, from my perspective, and so that was the end of that. The family moved from there to Maywood, as many Italian families did, out west.
Oh, yeah?
Oh yeah, they moved after they left Ogden Avenue. They moved out to Maywood, and part of my story takes
Okay,
place in Maywood.
I think Maria Rosaria had a question.
Yes,
Maria
I
Rosaria,
do.
you out
Okay.
there in
Thank you. Yes, Albert, Professor Melone. Compliments for your book. I
Thank you.
will try to read the book. The synopsis sounds very interesting. I also found interesting the set of values and the coping skills about Italians in America. I myself grew up in Chicago and I live in Italy right now. My question centers on the role of the piazza.
Yeah.
Italians tend to be very sociable, communicating people, even gossipers, but gossip generates stories, fiction, and it's good to tell stories. But I sort of heard in your synopsis that Raquel's story centers on the encounters in the piazza. So what is your personal opinion about the role of the piazza in the building up of the life of an Italian in Italy and an Italian in America, where the piazza is seldom present?
Very good point. Very good question. And I've given this a little thought, maybe not as much as it deserves, but clearly the piazza in Italy was a sexist institution to begin with. I mean, it was for men only. And the women were not to be part of this. The men would sit around or walk around and gossip about who knows what, right? They try ideas out on each other and so on. But when the women had some money, they developed their own little parade. We learned they made their own little confab where they exchanged ideas. Women in Italy were in that sense maltreated, although mothers, of course, were highly respected, but women without money in particular were not widely respected, as no doubt you know. But when the children or the husbands sent money back from the old country, or from the America to the old country, that gave them greater status, and they were able to form their own confab. In my story, I tell about a friend of Ricciella who was independently minded, and the men were very angry at her about that, and they called her a putana, right? For such independence. How dare you behave that way? You're not acting properly. So it was a sexist institution. Now,
Yeah.
what does that have to do with America? Well,
It was a
part of
picture.
my story here, I think, is that in America, it's a different way of life. You know, in America, the sense of community is nowhere near the sense of community that you had in the old country. That here in America, it's the I-centered culture. It's a dog-eat-dog social Darwinist approach to America. True, that's not true in all cases, but it certainly was true at the turn of the century when these Italians came to America. This was the dominant ideology. Social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer, all of this stuff, anti-unionism, anti-collective action on the part of any workers or people was really frowned upon. Whereas Riccella's husband, Pete, is very community-minded. Yeah, he cared about his family, but he also realized you have to care about the community. Very important idea of him caring about the community. And he seems to me, when you read this, and you've read Alexis de Tocqueville, you say, hey, de Tocqueville was talking about what Pete and company were involved in. De Tocqueville talked about a concept called interest rightly understood. And interest rightly understood. And by that he meant Americans believe that looking after your fellow human being is in the end in your own best interest. What is good for one is good for all, that you build a stronger community. You know, high tide lifts all boats, as we like to say in America, right? That was Pete's point of view. And this was a source of conflict between Pete, the husband, and the wife, Ricciella. She was very family oriented. She says, what are you sacrificing your well-being and of our family for people you don't really know, who are not part of your family? You know, they're not even paisans. What are you doing? And he says, well, no, I'm sorry, this is an important principle. Now, in defense of Ricciella is a good Catholic. She knows not only her catechism, but she knows something about the Gospels. Think of the Gospel of Mark, who says, your first duty is to love God, and your second duty is to love others as you love yourselves, or as we love ourselves. That she had a theologically based notion of community, which is very Italian in some ways, but he had a more practical, secular perspective on community, which is this de Tocqueville notion of how Americans actually behave. In the end, you'll see at the end of the book, Riccella's, after Pete is gone and it's before she dies, she's talking to her younger brother, who's this idealist all along, who was in America,
Anthony,
joined
yeah.
the Italian army to go on during World War I, because he believed that Italy had a future. And indeed, he becomes a supporter of Mussolini, although he's disillusioned in the end. But Ricciella admits that in the end, you know, I think Pete was probably right. That we have to think about the community, the wider community beyond ourselves. At least that's the interpretation I put on things. So yeah, your point is well taken. The notion of community is central. It's community versus the individual and how we can work this out. And indeed, I think it's my basic thesis that the Italian American experience can teach the rest of America a lot about community. Why? Think about the importance of the family unit. You gotta be cohesive. You gotta learn your values there. You gotta learn to be smart, right? You gotta survive. And you do that through a sense of community. And I argue further, like in my latest book, which I have behind me, just conveniently placed, Political Culture in the Age of Trump. I talk about the importance of what's happening in America, where we have a breakdown of group norms, of group attachments. And what we have is something more akin to a mass culture with mass men and women. This is an expression of Eric Hoffer's earlier book. You remember back in the 50s, The True Believer. He wrote The True, a wonderful book. Very provocative proof. I think book. He obviously exaggerates a lot in the book, but he makes his point that the mass man is a person who's alienated, who's disappointed, that he wants to get rid of the present and looks to the future, and he gives his whole attachment, his whole being to the movement, believing that he can rid himself of his frustration, of his inadequacies, of his disappointments in life. And that it seems to me that if you're well grounded in the family, you can get by this. You can get through the trials and tribulations of life in modern America.
Mario Cuomo used to use the family as a metaphor in a lot of his speeches, and his sense of we're in this together like a family. I think other politicians have also used that kind of metaphor, that we are a family. I don't know that it's been one political group or one ethnic group or another, but I do remember Mario Puzo referring to the family quite a bit in his speeches.
I think you're right.
Cuomo
did this. Yes, that's true. But it's easily forgotten. You know, part of the problem, of course, is that the later generation, my generation and those that have followed, have lost touch with much of the Italian culture. And so they need a way back. So they need to read books like mine and others out there, it seems to me, to figure out what the heck transpired. You know, why have we become what we are as human beings? And I think much of this can be explained in the breakdown of groups, and most importantly, the family is a primary unit of analysis. Now, having said that caveat, there can be too much cohesion in the family. You know, the parents wanted to hold on to the kids, right? Didn't they? They wanted them close. Don't move away. Stay close. Stay in the same block. Stay in the same house if you can. Many parents advise their offspring. And what has happened, because America is America the way it is, people have moved away. Not only away from the block, the neighborhood, the city, but half a continent away, or in other countries. And they have not gone back to the old family values, the rules of the family, and so on. So you have to worry about too much cohesion. Your students there at Loyola would certainly have experienced this problem with their parents or their grandparents in particular. Now, it's certainly understandable why people would feel this way, you know. I mean, and indeed, there is a good part of this. It provides security, a psychological anchor. This is wonderful. On the other hand, it can stifle creativity and mobility and whatever it would, you know.
I think Carla has a question.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to second a lot what you're saying. I mean, certainly, we talk about that in some of my classes in the literature we read, this sort of how the early immigrant families were able to improve their economic standing because of an intradependence, that the entire family was expected to pull together and contribute to the the financial health of the family, whether it was running a business or whatever. And this flip side of that the expectation that you were supposed to subvert your personal needs. And women, I would think in general, were asked to sacrifice a great more in that regard. And that's why you saw the young men being the ones who more often broke off and did that. But my question for you, Dr. Melone, was, yes, it is important that we share these stories with younger generations. That's what I try and do with my classes. I wanted to know what other Italian authors you might have read, and what other works you think have contributed to preserving this history, and that on your personal must-read list,
Yeah, well, there's maybe 4 or 5 books by this wonderful professor from Rhode Island. What's his name? Pizzoli, or I can't remember his name right offhand. But he wrote these great books.
Peter Pezzulli.
Yeah, Peter Pezzulli.
Peter Pezzulli, yes.
Which I think are wonderful books. And they tell a similar story. They're all similar in that sense about the importance of family and so on. But I think these are beautiful stories.
You mean Ed Anicelli?
Beg your pardon?
There's also Peter Pezzulli writes fiction. He's from Rhode Island. And then there's a Dr. Ed Anicelli, who sometimes joins us for these, who also has written memoirs about his own upbringing, his own life growing up as an Italian American in Rhode Island. So.
Oh yeah, right. There's a book entitled Vita. I forget the author's name.
Yeah, that's an Italian author. That's by Melania Mazzucco.
Excellent.
That was the first. She was the first author in Italy who published a work that looked at the emigration experience, and she researched her own family history to piece that together. She found out that she had one of these birds of passage returnees in her own family, and she reconstructed a fictionalized account of what might have happened to that character.
It's a wonderfully written book. I think it's first-rate piece of work.
Yeah.
And of course, Mario Puzo's first book, what's it called?
The Fortunate Pilgrim, yes.
Yes, excellent.
I think that's a beautiful work too, yes.
Yes, wonderfully done. It's ignored generally, though, isn't it, by the public? I mean, Godfather is the book.
Well, that's why he wrote The Godfather. He admits in his own memoirs and his papers afterwards, he said he wrote what he thought was a great work, and it got critical acclaim, but he didn't make any money, and his family accused him of being a chooch, because he supported his family.
Yeah.
So the way he tells his story is that he wrote The Godfather intentionally looking to write a bestseller so that he could make money and no longer be considered a chooch. And we all know, of course, he's not Sicilian, and that he relied on newspaper accounts and the Valaki figures and a heavy dose of stereotype and popular culture to make that story happen.
And Dominic's books are very helpful too.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
They're wonderful books, including I think I don't know if it's the last one or not the Italian Women in Chicago. I found those a really wonderful selection of case studies there.
Yeah, it's available on Amazon at $13.99.
Oh, well, I bought it a long time ago. It's an excellent book.
Probably you paid a higher price.
I don't know what price it paid for it.
Anyhow,
well worth it, whatever it was.
If there are no further comments, we'll ask you to close out. What should we take away from this little talk today, Albert?
Oh, I shouldn't say I don't know. I tried to indicate that the family is of great importance to understanding the Italian American experience. You got to center on that, and it's also important for future generations, other generations, that they need to look to that history for guidance as sort of a way back. We've got a lot of intermarriages, and that's okay. That's fine. As one of my characters say in the book, it's probably good for the bloodline. Mix it up. That's probably a good thing. But nonetheless, it's a way back from anonymity, from enemy, from alienation. there's much to be proud of, obviously, in being Italian. I mean, and that story needs to be told. And it's really interesting how attitudes toward Italians have changed, I think, even in our lifetime, where at one point we were despised by many, but now it's somewhat different. Also, you have to look at individualism versus community, and also the perspective from the church. I tell the story about Ruccella's always getting back to the church. That religion is an important way of understanding what it means to be Italian. In fact, she says in one of the lines that to love is to be Italian. To be Italian, you must love. Loving is where it's at. And gee whiz, we sure need a lot more of that in America today.
Thank you very much.